Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. Jim Garrison, we hope will be joining us soon, but I'm going to begin our broadcast by myself, and I want to welcome you to part two of our discussion in the Great Books Seminar. And today we are going to be going in depth to the fascinating and profound heart of the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. For those of you who have this text nearby, this wonderful book, you might want to open it to chapter 42, which is on page 77. This chapter right here, for me, is one of the greatest revelatory texts that I've ever encountered. And it is a profound spiritual map of the soul's quest for wisdom. Words that I think that we can all yearn for in these times, about how to pass through the dark valley of shadows and effects of forgetfulness, the truth and the beauty, which is our deepest nature. So we're going to be exploring this marvelous text together today and diving into that. And I'm going to also set the stage for a discussion of this pivotal passage by reviewing a little bit, just very quickly. I know we have many of you were with us last time, but a few were not. So just to summarize what this text claims to be and its place within the historical canon, and what it can guide us to in terms of questions to hold and to think. And I want to invite you as we go also on this journey to just really notice. We're going to take your questions at the end of our time together. So as anything arises, please go ahead and put that in the chat box. But one of the things that Mary Magdalene offers us, and one of the things that this text in particular offers us, is this deep invitation to find a sense of at-one-ment. Rather than atonement, we think about some of the more traditional perspectives on Yeshua, more frequently called in the English language Jesus, but here Yeshua, and his teachings. And that notice inside how different it feels if you think about the process of spiritual development as being a wise teacher, an enlightened teacher, who guides us to our own fulfillment and enlightenment and sense of being at one with the divine, versus what many of us grew up with as a doctrine of atonement, of blood sacrifice for the transgressions of Adam and Eve. And we're going to be talking about this in particular because one of the central parts of chapter 42 is this idea that there are trees. There is the tree of the fruit of knowledge that Adam and Eve ate in the mythical Garden of Eden. And then, on the other hand, there is the tree of life. We could call it even the tree of wisdom. And in this chapter 42, which you'll find on page 77 then, this idea of the tree of life and its connection with our own bodies, our own sense of embodiment, that inside us, inside our very being, there is also a tree. And as we ascend in our spiritual journey, just as Adam and Eve ate the fruit of darkness that led, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of knowledge that led to darkness, so too there is a pathway to follow that brings us back to light, to a cyclical journey of wholeness in which we return to a state of purity and completion and rest in this great place of silence after revelation and fulfillment. So I want us to notice that in this pathway of at-one-ment, part of the teaching of this astonishing book is the alignment between our heads and our hearts. And in the great mystical tradition that we can trace its roots to Mary Magdalene and the contemplative tradition in France, this is so much what the mystical pathway is all about. to learn to see with the eyes of our heart, to learn to hear with the ears of our heart. In the great iconic traditions of France, in particular, some of the statues that you find on Notre Dame Cathedral, this image of taking your head and placing it at your heart and being able then to have this at-one-ment between the two, rather than a schism of head over here and heart over here. So I want to invite us all into the place where you notice as we go through our time together here, what plucks the strings of your heart? Where do you feel an embodied sense of awakening, a visceral thrill, a moment of where you have your breath taken away, or you get goosebumps or chills or just a little tingling in your body? And I'd really like to pay attention to these, and perhaps we might share those in the chat box about when you have a goosebump moment. So I'm going to go now, and we're going to go to this screen share so that I can share with you some slides here as we go and set the stage for this wondrous journey that we're about to have together. This image is a painting by my dear friend and student, Sue Ellen Parkinson. And it's one of those moments of synchronicity that as she was coming on pilgrimage with me to Le Baume, the legendary place of Mary Magdalene, the very place that Mary Magdalene may have brought this text with her from Alexandria, Egypt, that here, this image shows Mary Magdalene as an elder, gazing with compassion and love and tenderness to a spiritual seeker, a jar of balm at her feet, and then behind her this tree. And this tree with these branches that interlaced are these qualities that, so many of the qualities that Sue Ellen put in this tree are actually the qualities that we see Mary Magdalene embodying in this very text that we're going to be talking about. So I want us to just take a moment and put your hand on your own dear heart as we think, as we go on this journey, as we think and feel in this quest for spiritual enlightenment and revelation. So we want to remind ourselves that the canonical Magdalene, the Magdalene of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if we look at her by name, we see the faithful witness. We see the image, the very image of the woman who was at the foot of the cross, present for suffering and death, but also commissioned and charged to go to the other disciples, the male disciples, who had fled in fear and terror, and that she was the bearer of the good news of her experience in the garden in the Gospel of John. She was the privileged first witness. And so her original title within Christianity, the apostle to the apostles, or in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the equal to the apostles. And this image here from Santa Maria sopra Minerva that says maestra, which means master or teacher of the apostles. And there's Barnabas. And she is instructing him with the open book, an image that is so consonant with the Magdalene that we have here in the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, where she is not only Yeshua's consort, not only the teacher and the disciple who sits at his feet and who absorbs his wisdom, but she is commended as the mother who will not leave the children orphans, that after Yeshua's own passing, in one of those exquisite, the one that occurs at the Last Supper when the disciples are beset by fear, and he says, "Do not fear, do not be afraid, I shall not leave you orphans. For after the father leaves, it is the mother who tends to the children." So here, vividly portrayed in a Catholic church, is an image that I think is so profoundly consonant with the image that we have in these pages of Magdalene as the maestra, the master, the teacher, the mystical mother to the other disciples who guides them in their quest for wisdom. And if we think archetypally about the symbol of an open book and what that means for someone to be an open book, it is someone in whom there is no guile, there is no deception, there is transparency, there is clarity, there is truth, there is honor. All of those virtues that Magdalene masters and embodies in chapter 42. But we know, as I mentioned last time, a few weeks ago, that historically what happened is so much of Mary Magdalene's legacy was cut out of the picture. It was lost. Some of it was deliberately erased. We know this historically. We can find testimony after testimony, and you can read so many books that will make your blood boil about her erasure from the picture, from the story, as we saw in this image, where there's the gaping hole where she should have been as the chief apostle, the woman who knew all. And one of the things that I celebrate in our own time is that we are living in a time of restoration. And we have all of these documents that have come to light and have been translated in the 20th century, including the treasure trove of Gospels from Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in which we discover that Mary's role as faithful disciple is amplified. And when we look at Gospel of Thomas, Dialogue of the Savior, Gospel of Philip, that were all rediscovered in Nag Hammadi, as well as other important recovered texts like the Pistis Sophia or the Manichaean Psalms of Heraclides, we have this much fuller and richer picture of the missing pieces, in which indeed Magdalene is the woman who knows all, the woman who is perfected in wisdom more than all thy brethren, in one of the texts. And it's certainly one of the most fascinating stories that has come to light and only been translated in our own lifetimes is the Gospel of Mary, in which there are 3 copies, some in Coptic, some in Greek. And these fragments, you can see from this image that it's torn and it's in fragments, and we've lost these pages, but the little tatters that remain give us deeper insight into a visionary path of ascent, and also point out the incredible tensions that were present in the first few centuries of Christianity, as the different disciples had different perspectives. And in particular, the very literalistic, and we might say patriarchal perspective of Peter and Andrew was very much at odds with the perspective of inner development and inner awakening that Mary Magdalene taught and embodied. And these 2 pathways diverged in the first few centuries of Christianity, and we know which pathway came to ultimately triumph and be defined as orthodoxy. So this text that we are so lucky to have come to light in our own time is fascinating because it gives us a fuller picture. And what it shows us is a text that could be potentially, there are claims that this is the case, an text, an original text for some other sources, some of which have become canonical and accepted by orthodoxy, others which are still on the fringes or considered heretical. So first and foremost is the Gospel of John. And last time we gathered, we looked at how so much of this text, actually the majority of this text, runs parallel to the Gospel of John, with the same sort of narrative of John the Baptist in the beginning, and the trial, and the scene of resurrection in the garden, and the crucifixion, and some of the miracles that happen, the woman at the well. So much of that is parallel with the Gospel of John. Secondly, this text of the Gospel of the Beloved Companion then also has many profound parallels with the fragments that we have of the Gospel of Mary. There is a wonderful analysis that the editor and translator Jean de Poulengy gives us of the parallels between these 2 texts, and I commend that to your attention to look at in detail if you're of that inclination scholarly, to put side by side the copies that we have of the Gospel of Mary with the latter chapters of the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. And we will see this general consonance, and I'm going to take up some of that action in a moment. And then to remind us, there are also some of those wonderful logions, those sayings from the Gospel of Thomas that point us to this inner awakening of the kingdom of heaven being within, and that it is what we bring forth from the Spirit that is inside of us that will lead us, or if we don't, it will lead us to our death. And similarly, we have a few fragments of the Gospel of Philip. Now, lastly, one of the things that I want to say, and I'm not a Kabbalistic scholar, and I imagine there might be a few of you listeners who are, and I would love your perspective on this, and it would make an excellent paper for those of you who are in the doctoral program, to take a look at the Jewish mystical tradition of the Kabbalah and how there are teachings, particularly in chapter 42, that parallel that great tradition. One thing that as a historian I find fascinating to note is that it is claimed that this text was originally brought by Mary Magdalene in Alexandrian Greek with her. She went first from Jerusalem, then to Alexandria for a few years, and then found her way with her companions, the so-called Les Amis de Bethany, or the Friends of Bethany, found herself arriving on the shores of Provence with this text, the text of the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, written in Alexandrian Greek with her. In the 12th century, it was this text that was translated into the vernacular language of Occitan, which is the vernacular language of southern France. At the time, it was known as Aquitania or Occitan. And that it was, I think it's deeply suggestive and significant that at the very century when this text was translated then into the vernacular language, that the Kabbalistic movement emerged full-blown in literary form also in southern France as a vernacular movement. So that, again, I'll just throw that out there. I think that would make a fascinating paper for a ubiquity student to write, is to look at the parallels historically and textually and imagistically. So we want to say that this idea of the beloved companion or the beloved disciple or the disciple that Jesus loved has been an enigma throughout history, that from the very early centuries there have been speculations, even by people like the church father Irenaeus of Lyon, who suggested that this might be Mary Magdalene, a topic of enormous scholarly contention over the centuries. But clearly in our text that we're looking at, this is who she is, that Mary Magdalene is the author of the text, that could be the text of the Gospel of John, that she is the beloved companion, she is the beloved disciple, she is the one who leans her head on Christ's chest and listens to the beat of his heart. And if we think of that as an archetypal image, what is it to be the one who is so intimately connected to the heart of Jesus? So this text then, if we imagine it arriving on the shores of France, what was then known in those days as Gaul, the same root as the Galatians or Gaelic, and that it becomes a source of a kind of Christianity that flourishes in the Western world that's quite different than the path of Rome. In fact, this text, this teaching, and Mary Magdalene are really the contemplative root of what we might call the Celtic Christian tradition, that her teachings spread and went from the south of France, up through France, into northern Italy, over into the Pyrenees, over into parts of Spain, and then up into the British Isles. And as we think of Mary Magdalene then as preacher, as teacher, so many of the images of her in that role show her in nature, this deep connection to nature. So here, Magdalene in the forest, teaching outside. And then our legends tell us that she turned to the forest of La Baume. She went through this forest that had been dedicated to Artemis. She went into the cave here where John Cassian centuries later arrived to establish the first double monastery in the West where men and women co-taught, where men and women prayed in a spiritual practice that was dedicated to the opening of the heart, to developing the prayer of the heart. And much of John Cassian, who's a saint in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, much of his writing also parallels the Magdalenian teaching that we have here in the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. What eventually coalesced as the 7 deadly sins originally comes from John Cassian's writing, writing that he did here in the sanctuary of La Baume, where legend had it that Mary Magdalene had her text and carried out her teaching and her contemplative practices. So I hope that you feel the shimmers and echoes of this, that this incredible mystic lineage goes to this cave of the heart. And if we even hold gently the possibility that this story is not just emotionally true, but factually correct, what a buried and lost lineage that we are reclaiming in our time. That Magdalene's teaching of enlightenment, of awakening, really echoes through in this hidden underground stream from this cave of contemplation, of holding life and death simultaneously, of purification through praxis, of at-one-ment through a gradual, deliberate, dedicated practice, of spiritual awakening through this step-by-step map that we get. A historical reminder then that we do know that there was some form of the Gospel of John that was used by many communities of what were known throughout southern France as good Christians, or les bons chrétiens, or les bons hommes. And that at the dawn of the 13th century, then, that there was this tragic, horrific persecution known as the Alexandrian Greek, in which mass genocide occurred. And that under torture, under systematic torture that was part of the medieval Inquisition, what emerged in the inquisitorial records was that they confessed that they had one gospel, and what they said about the gospel was written that it was the Gospel of John, that there were enough parallels. So one line of thinking and inquiry and scholarship is that this text that we're looking at today was in fact the very document that was the treasure of the Cathars, that they themselves were burned at the stake, but their books were burned at the stake. And that is the author's reason for having this be underground for the next 100 years at great cost to the community's life. This document was smuggled into Spain, was kept and safeguarded over the centuries, and amongst not insignificant contention, Jean de Coulon did bring this text to the English-speaking world in its translation to be recovered. So we hold in our hearts as well the great cost that alternative texts have often cost the very people for whom they were their treasures. This is the remains of one of the Cathar castles in this horrific persecution, and this symbol of the dove that marks place after place after place in France of this. So we might say, as in this image, that Mary Magdalene has been in the shadows. And here is a site named for her, La Madeleine in the Dordogne, but that she is gradually now emerging. She's coming into light. Certainly one of the signs of emergence are this proliferation of texts that point to the pivotal role that she played, and even beyond Mary Magdalene, that other women played in the early Christian movement, that in the first few centuries they were partners, they were equals, they were koinonos, to use that Greek word. They were spiritual companions who were empowered to deliver this message of Jesus, a message of liberation, of counter-cultural liberation that honored and valued the feminine in its depth, and that story was gradually erased, and that we are lucky enough to be living in a time of restoration, in a time of restoration. So as part of that restoration, I want us to turn then to the so-called missing pages of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Because while historical records suggest that when it was recovered at the very end of the 19th century and brought to a scholar, this document that came from Egypt was brought to a German scholar, and yet in the process of translating it before it came to light, water pipes broke, pages went missing, and what we have are only fragments. And in that text, I'll just remind us, for those of you who have already read the Gospel of Mary or have read this text and its analysis, that Mary Magdalene is the tower. She is, one of the meanings of Magdalene is tower, and so the tower of strength. And while the other male disciples are afraid and terrified, Peter has denied Jesus 3 times, Mary alone is the tower of strength. And they turn to her and they say, tell us the words of the teacher that you know that we do not know. And that image is so consonant with the text that we have from Nag Hammadi, where she is the privileged student who understands more than the others. So in this chapter 42 then, just go ahead and open up your books to page 77. I'm going to read a few parts of this aloud. And I invite you actually to go ahead and close your eyes, because so much of Magdalene's teaching in the other texts of the Gospel of Mary is about the nous, the new, cultivating the imaginal realm, the visionary realm. So I invite you to close your eyes and see what image comes arise as you hear these words. The Migdala answered and said, what is hidden from you, I will proclaim to you. And she began to speak to them the words that Yeshua had given her. My master spoke thus to me. He said, Miriam, blessed are you who came into being before coming into being, and whose eyes are set upon the kingdom, who from the beginning has understood and followed my teachings. Only from the truth I tell you, there is a great tree within you that does not change, summer or winter, and its leaves do not fall. Whoever listens to my words and ascends to its crown will not taste death, but know the truth of eternal life. And then he showed me a vision in which I saw a great tree that seemed to reach unto the heavens. And as I saw these things, he said, the roots of the tree are in the earth, which is your body. The trunk extends upwards through the 5 regions of humanity to the crown, which is the kingdom of the Spirit. There are 8 great boughs upon this tree, and each bough bears its own fruit, which you must eat in all its fullness. As the fruit of the tree in the garden caused Adam and Eva to fall into darkness, so this fruit will grant to you the light of the Spirit that is eternal life. Between each bough is a gate and a guardian who challenges the unworthy who try to pass. The leaves at the bottom of the tree are thick and plentiful, so no light penetrates to illuminate the way, but fear not, for I am the way and the light. And I tell you that as one ascends the tree, the leaves that block one from the light are fewer. So it is possible to see all more clearly. Those who seek to ascend must free themselves of the world. And if you do not free yourself from the world, you will die in the darkness that is the root of the tree. But if you free yourself, you will rise and reach the light that is the eternal life of the Spirit. And as he said these things, I felt my soul ascend. Now, what then happens in the next few pages, and I hope each of you will read this chapter again and again and again. And I'm just going to call to your attention a couple of the great parallels with other traditions, because I think it's quite fascinating. So what happens next is that as Mary Magdalene ascends in her vision, in her imagination, that what she sees in the tree in her body, there are these, what I would call threshold guardians then. And she has to confront each one of these threshold guardians and pass. Now we know from archetypal psychology and mythology that this is a very potent archetype. If you think of all of the great fairy tales and Lord of the Rings, in which it's always a dragon that guards the treasure. The dragon, there's a cave, and then there's gold, and then there's the dragon that the hero must pass through, and they must be able to pass through these gates. We think of the great mythology of the gates of Inanna and her descent into the underworld in order to ascend to become the queen of heaven. We think of the 7 chakras in the Eastern tradition and how at the base of each one of these chakras there is also said to be a demon guardian who has to be expelled in order to liberate and open that chakra to illumination. We think of the great Vedic and Islamic traditions in which there are 7 heavens. We think of Dante. I think especially of Dante. And Dante in the Divine Comedy, in Purgatory, all souls on their journey to paradise must go through this process of transformation where they ascend up those 7 deadly sins that come from John Cassian's writing. He originally had 8, isn't that interesting? But it turned into 7. And Dante himself has 7 P's for peccatores, for sins. And as he is purified, each one of those sins falls away. So that when you have purified all 7 of these sins, when you have opened all 7 of the chakras, when the dragons have been expelled at each of these threshold points, that what you have is someone who's fully enlightened. We would have a bodhisattva. We would have someone who is completely spiritually liberated and in fact at one with the divine. And that is very much then what we get here is this image. In the words of David Tressimer, the 7 demons being expelled, that this passage, if this is the text, this may be the basis for Luke's remark that Mary Magdalene had 7 demons cast out from her. Well, what that would imply is that she was the most spiritually exalted, in fact, the most purified, in fact, one might say, in equal with Christ himself as a bodhisattva. So these gates that Magdalene must pass through include these characteristics: judgment and wrath. Over and over throughout this text, we have the incredible emphasis on judge not. Of course, that's parallel with the Synoptic Gospels, in which we have judge not yet lest ye be judged. We have those words of Jesus in the canonicals as well. But over and over in this text, Jesus says, I judge no one, and yet if I judge, my judgment would be true, for it would be in alignment with the Spirit. But here we must conquer the implication that each of us must conquer our own tendency to be judgmental. And then there's the quality of wrath, which was in fact one of the 7 deadly sins. Ignorance and intolerance, duplicity and arrogance, the weakness of the flesh, and then the illusion of our fears. Now, I want to invite you to just consider this question about if we took nothing else from this book but this map and did a study session. This would be an amazing Lenten study session to take each one of these qualities and to work and to go through a process of discernment. How can I be free? How can I be liberated from these qualities that stand? These are the dragons. These are the demons that stand between me and my fulfillment, that stand between us as humanity and our enlightenment. What would it be like if we were to be free from all of these? What if that was to be a primary spiritual practice? The image that you have on your screen actually comes from the chapel in Glastonbury, that's St. Patrick's Chapel. Legends say that St. Patrick himself became a bishop at Glastonbury Abbey, and he studied to become a monk off the shores of France at Lorenz Abbey on Ile-Honorat. And this image in the back of St. Patrick's Chapel is of Mary Magdalene, and what you see are the demons leaving her. She is being unbound. She is being freed. She is being liberated. And now when I look at that image, I imagine that these are the qualities that she is being liberated from. And what would that mean for each and every one of us to follow that pathway? So in chapter 42, as Mary Magdalene then confronts these demons of ignorance and intolerance, then, it's such a gorgeous poetic image, then she reaches and she must eat in it the fullness of the fruit of the bough. And these are the boughs, the 8 boughs. And just imagine, I imagine someday, wouldn't it be magnificent to do a ritual around this at Chartres Cathedral, at Ubiquity, or at La Baume with me next year in France, to do a ritual where we have some juicy plum or pomegranate or apple or peach, 8 fruits, and then we eat in the fullness of love and compassion. That we eat in its fullness the fruit of wisdom and understanding. Just imagine the juice running down your chin and down to your heart. That we eat in the fullness of the fruit of honor and humility, of strength and courage, of truth and clarity, of power and healing. And then ascending from the voice, we go beyond the inner voices that say to us, I think it's so fascinating, you are not worthy. That passage of, you are not worthy, and Magdalene must confront that voice inside as well, that tells us that we are not worthy. It's not unlike the Buddha's enlightenment, in which the demons assailed him and he pointed to the earth and said, the earth bears witness to my right to be here. I think there's, again, another fascinating doctoral paper you could write parallels between the Buddha's enlightenment and chapter 42. And then Magdalene ascends beyond these voices, beyond the little voices of the ego that, to each of us, beyond the voices that assail us, telling us, who are you? What are you doing? Part of the mystic path is to move beyond those voices that would limit us. And then, having eaten of that, of coming into the power and healing, coming in to the fruit of light and goodness and grace and beauty, she finds herself in the realm beyond words, in silence. And this beatific vision, and the vision, so important, is of the feminine. We talked last time about how in this text, when Yeshua talks about the Holy Spirit, it is a she, and how that is consonant with Yeshua's own tradition. In Aramaic, Holy Spirit would have been she. Hebrew would have been ruah, also she. Aramaic and Hebrew, the Holy Spirit was feminine. And here, this beatific image, this vision in brilliant clothes, brilliant white, that this vision is the feminine face of God. And she comes then, and I love this passage that we find on page 80, that she says, it always gives me goosebumps. I felt my soul drawn into this embrace, and in that moment I was freed from the world, and I realized that the fetter of forgetfulness was temporary. And from now on I shall rest through the course of the time of the age in silence. And then, as if from a great distance, I heard the voice of my master tell me, Miriam, whom I have called the Migdala, now you have seen the all, and have known the truth of yourself, the truth that is I am. Now you have become the completion of completions. This vision that ends in silence and that Mary holds in silence, I will tell you, I believe profoundly, is the root of the Christian contemplative tradition that can stretch itself out through John Cassian and Cassian monks, up to the next iteration, which is Benedictine spirituality, up to the Franciscan spirituality, that the deep, deep core teachings of this made its way into the profoundest part of the Christian contemplative tradition. And it stands very much at odds with much of the doctrine that evolved in the West, a doctrine of atonement, a doctrine of hierarchy, and doctrine in which one looks outside for wisdom and liberation rather than inner awakening and enlightenment. So in this text then, this is what we have, is this profound teaching. And like in the Gospel of Mary, the reaction of the other disciples is divided. And first and foremost, those who became orthodoxy, Peter and Andrew, say this teaching is too difficult. I can't accept it. And they bump against it, and it's not something that they are able to embrace. There are other disciples, however, chiefly here, Levi, also known as Matthew, who come to Mary's defense. And both in the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Beloved Companion, the message is she was the most faithful of all the disciples. She is the one that Jesus trusted to appear for the resurrection. She is the one who did not flinch, who was at the foot of the cross. She is the one who has understood him from the beginning. How can you doubt her? And yet what we see in this final chapter are the schisms that began, the cracks in this community that start to emerge, that then defines the history of Christianity in the next 2,000 years. The followers of Magdalene, the followers of Peter, the followers on Peter's side that went towards institutional hierarchy, the followers of Mary Magdalene that flourished in the Celtic lands, that emphasized the pathway of inner awakening, of inner gnosis that is available to each and every one of us in the depths of our hearts. If we have the ears to hear, if we sit in the contemplative practices of listening with the ear of our heart, the promise is that the goodness, the truth, the beauty that is the divine imprint, that is our deepest nature, will be something that we can connect to, so that we too can flower in our fullness, that we too can become the completion of what we were meant to be. So it is my hope, I told you that the head and the heart, I long for them to be united. And if this text is true, and oh, does the scholar in me yearn to find proof and evidence and look at documents, but I will tell you, my heart personally has leapt ahead and said, this is a text that I believe is a trustworthy map for inner awakening. And over the years I've turned to it. It has given me consolation and wisdom and inspiration. It's my hope that it will do the same for you. And before we open up the lines for chat, I just want to mention a few things in which this text will be explored in other ways. Coming up very soon, actually on Thursday, then we've got Rosa Mystica at Chartres, and an international faculty of 8 scholars will be coming together, and a beautiful Banafsheh Sayad will be leading us in embodied practices, and the illustrative scholar Anne Baring will be teaching much from her own perspective on Mary Magdalene. So this text will weave its way through many of our divergent perspectives as we do Rosa Mystica this Thursday. It will also be the foundational text that we will go to in deep, deep dives with Mary Magdalene in the contemplative tradition, a pilgrimage in Provence that begins with Ubiquity August 23rd through 29th, where we will see very literally, as in this image right before you, that Mary Magdalene is this towering figure of spiritual authority, and underneath her cloak of compassion are the saints across the centuries, from John Cassian to St. Benedict to St. Francis to Hildegard of Bingen to Clara of Assisi. We'll follow in her footsteps and talk about the different legends of her arrival and her encounter with St. Sarah, and go through that forest of Artemis and go through that pilgrim path up to that cave of the heart, and how it establishes the Christian contemplative and mystical and Celtic traditions, from the island where St. Patrick became a monk to Saint Michel du Var, where they have her relic, and where the monk who translated the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jean-Yves Leloup, resides there. So this, I hope, before we come into our sharing, I hope that for you that this book is a doorway and a portal to more questions. The Gospel of Thomas, when it says, seek until you shall find, and when you find, you shall be disturbed. And yet if you persevere in that disturbance, you shall come to see and rule over all. I see that we have Jim with us now, so perhaps, Richard, will you unmute Jim first of all, and then we could turn to some of our questions and our students as we explore this. But I just urge you to keep coming and reading this, reading it not just with your mind, but with your heart, and see how it echoes and shimmers inside you, and what fruit of wisdom you can eat from this rich text. Jim, how nice to see your face. Hello.
Good to see you, Kayleen. I got lost in the Bartle state of Zoom before the so sorry about that, everyone. But welcome, Kayleen, and welcome all of you. And you all know the drill. I would like all the students to raise your hand and ask a question or make a comment on this very profound text. And I would start with a question, Kayleen, just to kind of get us rolling. If you had to distill down the tonality of the spirituality of Mary Magdalene, let's say as distinct from Francis of Assisi or say the Cistercians, what would you say was the essential quality that she embodied in a particularly distinctive way?
Mm-hmm. The word that I think best describes Mary Magdalene is the word that we find actually in Greek in the Gospel of Mary, which is anthropos, which means fullness of humanity. And we even have that reference here too, that she has become the full human or the perfected human. So not cutting off part of herself, but if we think of it as a Jungian term, what anthropos might be is having in balance head and heart, body and spirit, and all of those come into an integration. The image of Mary Magdalene for me really is this image of the rose in its fullness. And so many of the mystics who have been deeply, profoundly connected to Mary Magdalene have had this essence. It's the essence of our goodness and our sweetness and what is possible, the possibilities of being human, opening up in its essence to become full. So rather than a pathway of cutting off or dismembering part of ourselves, for me, she represents fulfillment, wholeness, and in Platonic tradition, beauty, truth, and goodness. All of those in one, in an embodied being.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's dive in, everyone. I see Katie and then Katina. Then the other doctoral students. So we'll start with Katie, Katina, and then Anika.
This is Katie. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Katie, try it one more time. We'll try this.
Can you hear me?
No, looks like
we lost Katie. Why don't we go to somebody else and we'll come back to her, Jim.
Okay, Anika.
Hi. Can you
Hello,
hear me?
we can hear you.
Perfect. Hi. Well, thank you. I am reading the book. I haven't finished it. To be truth, I find it a little hard to get into, probably the language. So I so appreciate, Kayleen, how you're guiding us through this and really pulling out the, when you were reading that little passage, it really spoke to me and I could see the book coming alive. So I really appreciate that.
So glad.
So, yes, I look forward to going back to it again. But I have a question that came up when you were talking about the 7 demons. When you brought up the weakness of the flesh, it is easy to think of that as sexuality and and also how it was sort of equalized to being the feminine, the female body, and how that was used in the patriarchy of the Orthodox Church to sort of justify the separation, like between the male and the female, as the male being more connected to spirituality. So I'd love your insight on that, if there's any alternate.
Thank you. A wonderful and deep, important question. I think one of the dangers of that phrase, and frankly, I wish I knew Greek and I could go to the Greek version of this so that I could see what might be other translations of that. But I think our danger is that that phrase has been used exactly the way that you are describing, that the word weakness and flesh has become in itself demonized over time and history. And so what it might have meant originally, I don't think it was necessarily sexual at all. I think when we think, for example, I'll just give you an example. One thing about weakness of the flesh is it's also coupled. I think it's really important that it says you have freed yourself from the weakness of the flesh and confronted and conquered the illusion of your fears. Now, for myself, and I imagine for many of the people who are listening here, when we are in a state of fear, our bodies get triggered into a fight or flight response, right? And so that could be another way of interpreting the weakness of the flesh, where we say that we're not in our right mind when that occurrence happens, and some people become attacking and others become so fearful that they run away. And we've all had those experiences in our bodies that have gone counter to our minds or our hearts. And I think that could take a number of different guises. I'm quite clear for myself that there is absolutely nothing in this text. I would almost call it a sexually neutral text, to be quite honest, because the emphasis on this entire book, the emphasis is on inner awakening and spiritual evolution. There is nothing negative about sexuality in it. Neither does it celebrate or highlight sexuality either. There are more modern texts that actually have much more to say about sexuality as a vehicle for connection and spiritual development, almost in a tantric tradition. But this is not a text that does this. So in some ways, it's like I think that one of the hardest things to do is uncouple Mary Magdalene, the baggage of Mary Magdalene, since Pope Gregory in the 6th century, where he took these 7 demons and he made them into sexualized elements. In that famous sermon that he gave in, I think it was 591, he said, what are the 7 demons but the 7 devices? And then he really sexualized it. And he talked about Mary's perfumed hair and anointing the feet and what she had done with her body. And he absolutely sexualized that. And ever since then, both in art and in writing, it is almost, I've found in my experience, almost impossible to decouple her. Just a tiny little aside, if I can share it. I was the mythologist in residence for an opera that was done by the San Francisco Opera called The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And the writer is actually the composer is a brilliant man. And he had read all the text and he wanted to put the Gospel of Mary there. But damn it, if at the very, but at the very beginning of the opera, he still had her be the adulterous woman. Like, he had read all the scholarship and he couldn't decouple it because he had his own issues about sexuality that he wanted to make a statement about. And it's so hard to do this. And I think there's really important discernment that needs to be made around this, because this text in particular doesn't say anything pro or con. As an icon of wholeness, we would expect that the human relationship, and in this case marriage, would be that, but it's not a focus of the text. And it's very hard given how much baggage, how much graffiti, how much damage that's been done in the name of women and to women, and in its anti-embodied man stance. There's so much healing that needs to happen on this. But that particular passage, I would urge us all to read in a different way. And excuse me, I got really carried away there for a moment. Sorry.
I really appreciate that. And when you were speaking, as I have a background in nutrition, and just thinking of weakness of the flesh, more from addictions, all kinds of addictions, whether it could be alcohol or drugs, and they would be more fitting, and it has nothing to do with gender. So
Exactly, or the number of food issues. If you look at
exactly, yeah,
what we have in our culture now with obesity and anorexia, there's so many things that are out of balance.
yeah, and we are sort of primed to fall into those addictive patterns, whether it's food cravings. Being in a human body, we're predisposed to that, like regardless if it was 2,000 years ago or today, and it's something that we have to, I guess, be able to overcome to reach that state.
Yeah, and to dig deep,
Yeah,
psychologically, from a psychological perspective, what's underneath those cravings? What's
exactly.
underneath that
Yeah.
fear, and how
It's-
can we liberate and heal that?
and that is very current.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
that.
Good. Thank you, Anika. And we'll circle back to Katie and see if we can get her in now.
Her audio is on.
Katie,
Can you
go
hear
ahead. Your audio's on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Kayleen, so much for the heart that you bring to this, and for asking these questions about how it feels, which has been really helpful for me as I'm reading it. Of course, finding myself thinking and analyzing. This is the first Christian anything that I've ever read. And I notice as I read through, I find myself triggered by a lot of old or not the original messages, but a lot of the messages that I've picked up about Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love this symbol of the tree and looking at the challenges that we have as humans and sort of the work to transcend these challenges that we must do in order to really sort of wake up and realize that death doesn't really exist at that level of transcendence. So yeah, I love it framed in this way, especially the slide that you had about sort of the values, like the love and compassion, honor and humility as guides, rather than bringing it back to like the sins and the shame that have been sort of communicated in church, pop church culture, and how this information in the right hands is so helpful and healing, and this information in the wrong hands can be taken, by narcissistic humans and lead people astray so many times in history. I think that's what triggers me a little bit about the book, is that it just at points I'm like, is this narcissism? Okay, how do I separate this from the human and see this as a spiritual thing? So anyhow, I'm just circling back. I want to set the intention to remember to feel my way through this and connect, with the spirit of Mary, which is very, very good-hearted and wholehearted and collective. Like she cares for the collective, and so yeah. That's it. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I think you point to something that is very hard for so many people, which is, I mean, I work personally with people all the time who have these really tragic stories about how growing up, their encounters with Christianity left them feeling filled with shame and filled with being excluded and judged, and how tragic that is, given that the words of the great teacher are about judge not. And if you look through that, the incredible acceptance and the incredible, even in what has survived, the incredible empowerment that Jesus as a teacher offered to women and the acceptance of women, and how that got changed and distorted over history is one of the greatest tragedies of all time, And it's a painful inheritance that we have. Those of us who feel profoundly connected to the depths of the Christian tradition, it's I would say it's no different than having to wrestle, in fact, in many ways even worse, to wrestle with the idea that your ancestors were slave owners, that what was done in the name of Christianity, particularly what was done as being seen as righteous acts of burning women at the stake, of burning people for owning a Bible, that must grieve every heart and soul of anyone who wants to follow Jesus. I mean, it is one of the most tragic things ever. And how that can be restored and healed is a question that must be addressed in our time. If Christianity is going to survive at all, if Christianity deserves to survive at all, it's a question that must be asked. Because there's so much that's good there, but it has been polluted and distorted and misused, and it breaks my heart as a contemplative Christian. It breaks my heart in pieces to know the history of Christianity. But it's like, knowing the history of your family, in which there's drug addicts and child molesters, and I mean, it's that bad. I mean, it's really, really hard, and I don't know of anybody as a Christian leader that I've had earnest conversation with who doesn't agonize about this. It's so painful, and yet there is beauty, truth, and goodness, and this book is one of those texts that points out, and there are the great mystics of throughout the centuries, Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila, T.S. Eliot, I mean, great mystics across the centuries who've given their hearts and souls to Christianity, that have so much to offer us as food for our troubled world. And it's this messiness of being human and realizing that the history of religion also mirrors the messiness of being human. And that pathway that I think in chapter 42 is one of the clearest articulations of how do we find our way through the mess. We confront these things: intolerance, ignorance, wrath. We eat of the fruit of love and compassion. We open our hearts to truth and clarity. For me, this is a good compass and a good step in the journey.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
I'm really emotional about this right now. You got to the core of it.
I appreciate you doing that. That's great.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you. Now let's turn to Katina, then Janice, and then Michelle.
Hello?
Hello. Yeah, we hear you.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Kayleen. Thank you so much. I just want to say, Kayleen, really appreciate your passion and how you, as the first speaker, Anika said, it's kind of like when I'm reading, I kind of go off, but then it's hard to like focus. So you bring so much light and passion to this book. And then, I have to go back and read a few. But I spoke last time about the trauma and how this helped me heal. But as I continue to read this, and so let me get a little bit of my background, what I do for work. I'm a special agent. I work in human trafficking investigations for Homeland Security investigations. So I've been working that for many years, and it's now coming to light. It's coming. It has a lot of attention. There's a lot of awakening going, on in the world. And, I'm also watching Humanity Rising. So it's all part of this. So this book right now is also a part of my awakening, because as I read it, I still think to myself, as a child growing up in Catholic school, the Bible that I read, it was like I was programmed. So when I'm reading this, I'm like, were they hiding this from me? Did my teachers, my nuns that were my teachers, did they know about this book? I'm 46, I'm 45, going to be 46. So at this point in my life, it's just like, wow. So I was just like programmed to believe something. And on my own, I had to research and open up my mind and kind of undo and relearn everything that I did about Christianity. And, like everyone says, the way that they described her, I grew up thinking she was a prostitute and she was not a good person to even speak about. It was almost like you shouldn't speak about her. You would be shunned. So I just am so amazed at and look forward to, finishing the book. I haven't finished it. And just hearing you speak about her and these presentations, because it's so beautiful. It's just a beautiful light. And I also see, the survivors I work with, how they feel shame and they feel shunned. And now I have something more, because a lot of them do come to this country, like from China, and I'm in the US and they claim asylum because they can't. They get beaten and arrested for studying Christianity. So I just want to thank you.
You're so welcome. And just thank you for this incredibly difficult, hard work that you do. And I would hope that you actually might hold her fast. There is this tradition in Catholicism of having your patron saint, and Teresa of Avila and Julian of Norwich and so many others have had Mary Magdalene as their patron saint, and Catherine of Siena. And just imagine, if you will, that it's her cloak that's around you, that it's her cloak of compassion that goes with you to do this incredibly difficult work that you're doing. And, I know as a historian there's nothing to Mary Magdalene about her being a prostitute. But one of the things that in my heart stays with me is a workshop I did where afterwards a woman came up and she told me that she had been trafficked. And that for her, Mary Magdalene was for her an umbilical cord, and that in the depth of her prayer, that she felt Mary Magdalene's presence and said, no matter who you are, no matter what has been done to you, you are worthy. You are worthy. They have called me all kinds of names, and I am your sister and I am your mother. And I tell you that nobody can take away that you are precious and beloved in the sight of God.
It's so beautiful.
I hope that you will hold her fast to your heart in your journey, and I hope that our paths will cross.
Oh, I totally will. And thank you so much for that. That's so beautiful. That gave me chills. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So let's go to Janice.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself there. I think you can hear me now?
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you. First of all, Kayleen, thank you again. This is just a wonderful day, and the explanation's great. What I appreciate so much is the concentration on the inner journey as opposed to the external world. And that has helped me immensely. And I found so interesting the parallels that you have already mentioned between the chakras and the Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic tree of life, and Mary Magdalene. I mean, it's thrilling. And then if you look at the neuroscience that we're doing through the neuroscience course and Marshall Lefferts' work, and you see the cosmometry and how it relates all into Mary Magdalene. And it just has absolutely thrilled me. And oddly, one question I'd had as a very young child, I asked my father about Melchizedek and Abraham. and wondered, who is Melchizedek and who are these two men that are building this altar? And he said, we'll talk about that when you're older. We never did. And so through your work and through working with Mary Magdalene in this book and the other books I've read related to her now, it seems that Melchizedek brought this same tree of life to Abraham and explained the mystery of that came from his Canaanite background. And I thought how gorgeous this whole thing is, that we are relating not just the masculine and the feminine, but globally different thought processes. I love that part of it. What it is doing personally for me is working with Joe Dispenza's work and the book that is related to this book in the course. Now, when Joe Dispenza talks about coming into a moment of silence and a moment of meditation and letting go of who you are, where you are, and being in connection with the divine, I find that Mary Magdalene's working through the tree has been magnificent.
Yeah.
Because now I can understand her so much better, and I can understand Joe so much better, and my own experience I find really very, very enlightening. One question that I have related to that, though, is clearly she gives us the negatives, the judgment column, and then the good column with the love and compassion. I do try and relate that then back to beliefs and emotions, because Joe Dispenza then asks us to let go, either articulate the belief or emotion we'd like to get rid of, or that we would like to attain. And so I am working with each of those areas, like weakness and flesh, illusions and fears, and saying, okay, what's the belief? Okay, what's the emotion? Can you comment on any work that possibly has been done like that?
I don't know of any, so that sounds
Sorry,
like
I can't hear you. I think you're not. I can't hear you, Kayleen.
I said I'm not familiar with anyone that's
Oh,
done it
sorry, I'm not hearing you.
well.
Kayleen, you're okay, but
I
it's her
guess I'm
problem.
somehow disconnected from your. I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm speaking, and um, I'll put the comment in the chat box.
Kayleen, I can't hear you. Okay.
So
Yeah, let's keep
One
going.
piece of, can you hear me, Kayleen?
I can hear you. I don't know why you can't
Okay,
hear me.
okay. The one piece of work that has helped me with emotions is Marshall Rosenberg. I've taken all of his work on non-judgmental communication, where he lists all the emotions, and then I've done a chart of that, and I will draw on that chart to help me with emotions. But that doesn't relate necessarily to beliefs, so that the beliefs that are
I
an
don't know if
issue.
you can hear me now.
Okay.
Maybe you can. Good. Okay. So one thing that I would point you to is that might be of interest, is the early Christian
I
tradition.
can't hear.
Okay, Richard, I'm not sure what's happening because can you hear me? Jim, can you
Yeah,
hear me?
no, you're fine, Kayleen. It's at Janice's end.
Okay.
So I'm sorry about that.
All right. Well, I'll answer this and then maybe she can hear it, read a text of it. But for those of you who are interested in this topic, I would suggest that you might want to turn to some of the writings of people like John Cassian. There's a book, he's the monk that I referred to who wrote his pivotal text in the cave of La Beaume. And there's much in the first few centuries of Christianity about dealing with the passions and the thoughts and coming to a place of equanimity and tranquility. So some of the writings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. So I'm going to suggest there's a couple of writings. This is sort of a side story, but part of the longer history that I'll be exploring in Mary Magdalene and the contemplative tradition is that there were these seekers of wisdom in the 4th century, many of whom went into the deserts of Egypt and were trying to follow a pathway of inner awakening through their own practices of study and song and silence, and even something that sounds like it could have been a lot like yoga. And these are known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And finding a good translation can be a little tricky, but there's a whole tradition here that eventually flows from the deserts of Egypt and then into the Eastern Orthodox tradition of something called the Philokalia, that is the love of beauty, truth, and goodness. And there's writings to this topic, and the topic of discernment, the topic of sorting through our thoughts, the topic of finding tranquility and equanimity. Sometimes they use the phrase apatheia, but I think it would be a mistake to call that apathetic. It's more like not being ensnared or entangled by the passions. So finding that place of tranquility and equanimity. So there is quite a bit in the Christian mystical tradition about that, and following what is called the prayer of the heart, writings on the prayer of the heart. And I'm just going to write in the chat box a couple of other writers, including some contemporary writers like Christine Volt-Paintner and Mirabai Starr, and their writings, and Thomas Merton on the Desert Fathers and Mothers. There might be something of interest to some of you there, and then John Cassian's work in particular. And there is a very interesting group right now that you can find on Facebook that's called Virtual Chapel, and I'm writing this in the chat box as well. And they have a group that is meeting on the Christian contemplative and mystical traditions, and they do book study groups. And one of the books that I know that they were looking at was looking at some of this very early writing, and with some figures that we're talking about, for example, the confluence of Greek mythology and mystery religions and prayer of the heart with Christian contemplative practices. So you might find that of interest, that's a resource for going further in some of the areas that touch a little bit on what you were exploring, Janice.
Thank you very much. I can finally hear you. So I very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. We're running out of time here, everyone. So we've got a lot more hands. So let's go to Angie Azur and Michelle Blair.
Angie's open, Jim.
Hello. So, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
What really struck me in this book was seeing the rules of the society and the laws of burial as showing the truth of which gospel really was showing the full truth and which gospel was maybe redacted to not include the full truth. So it really got me thinking about women in the church in general and wanting to know the truth of the times. What was the law? What was the truth? And then why was that? And who came up with that? And psychologically, what the heck was going on in society back then? So I'm just very curious and wanting to, interview, preachers or priests. I didn't grow up in the church, so this was very exciting for me to read the Gospels. I'd never done this before, but it just really awakened me to not just reading something and going, oh, that's somebody, that's somebody that has authority and can and teach, like the Bible, right, is an authority to a lot of people. But then looking at it and going, wait, what was really going on in society, law-wise, marriage-wise, relationship-wise? And I guess my biggest question for the people back then, and I wish I could talk to somebody who knows, a historian, but why did the church not want male and female to come together? Why wouldn't they think stronger together, both sides really speaking for, the holy and God and what's inside of us? Why get rid of half of us?
Oh, what a big question that is. The quick answer, I would refer you, since it sounds like you are interested in the historical part of things. The historian Jeremy McCulloch has written a book called Christianity, the First 3,000 Years. And if you have the appetite for it, it's about this thick, but it goes in great detail to the evolution of history in different parts of the world and why, and its changing face. And really to understand that we have this movement that goes from being a very small Jewish community. It's really important to understand the Jewish context of Christianity, and that by the 4th century, when it becomes adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire, what you have is a syncretism emerging. And so this tradition that originally was Jewish and then had these very different texts really becomes Romanized with the power and might of the emperor. And so many things happen in that pivotal, and some would say catastrophic, 4th century that really reshaped and changed the face of Christianity. And at the risk of making a political statement, I would say it's not unlike, if one looks at in the United States at certain political parties, how they have evolved over the beginning of their founding, and how they become symbolic and representative of things that are very different than the intentions of the original founders. And so looking at the history piece can be incredibly illuminating, although it can also be extremely upsetting, but I think it's important, very important to do. And I think far too many people neglect the Jewish context from which Jesus came from, and the fact that all of his disciples were Jewish, his mother was Jewish, everyone in that circle that you read about in Sunday school was Jewish. And knowing that, it does help you make some discernment over what might have been original messages and later redactions. And I think that that's very important for work for people to do as they're approaching the history of religion.
Well, the other thing I noticed on page 77, and I love the whole tree, I just, it was so resonating with me, was in the end when she sees God and it's a female, and Jesus doesn't say, no, you saw that wrong, or it's both, or whatever. And then she tells the other disciples, they immediately don't want to listen to it. So why? Why can we accept a male God, but a female God is like so scary? And I read this to my teenage sons, and they're like, oh, cool. Because, I don't raise them in the church either, because I don't know what that is. And they were like, that's really cool, Mom. I love it. So easy. My husband, who was raised Catholic, was like, that's not what I was taught, right? It's like, I'm like, yeah, but maybe there's something to look at here. To me, it doesn't matter. God is God. It's like energy. It's both things to me. But it's interesting that the disciples also were like, nope, can't be a woman. Why?
Yeah. And in the Jewish mystical tradition, God is male and female. There's the word Elohim and Yahweh, and those are two different words for the divine. But this concept of what's called the Shekinah, of the feminine indwelling spirit of God that is feminine. There's actually a beautiful ritual every Sabbath where you light the candles and you sing chants to welcome in the feminine presence of the divine.
Awesome.
So a whole tradition in Judaism that, again, is really important to understand, and it makes much more sense than when Jesus calls Holy Spirit she, to realize, well, that's what it would have been called in his tradition. It's not a change. But as Christianity became Romanized and it merged with certain all-male patriarchal traditions within the Roman Empire, like the Sol Invictus cult, for example, in which priests were celibate and only male, as opposed to having both males and females. It's a very complex historical story. And I think what is great, what I want to celebrate with you is you're asking the questions like, well, why not? What happened? When did this start? When was this? Was it always this way? And I think that those are really important questions for everyone who's a seeker of history or myth or spirituality to be asking.
Thank you, Kayleen. It's awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you, Angie. We have time for one more. Michelle Blair.
Michelle's mic's open.
Yeah, a few things with this. The first thing that comes to me is just the reverence and gratitude to the men and women who lost their lives protecting this gospel. I had a lot of emotion about that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that, excuse my ignorance on the topic, one thing that triggered me is this idea of the beloved companion. That doesn't feel energetically accurate to me, because there still feels like a like denoting a hierarchy, like companion is someone coming along with, or and when I sat with it, as I understand it, Jesus or Yeshua was speaking in Aramaic, which is feminine, the feminine language. And I think that as soon as it was put into writing, it was already skewed. And my experience so far with all of this is that Mary was the essence, was the teachings, was the word, and it needed to come through Yeshua. A lot of maybe what came through Yeshua was actually from the essence of Mary, but it had in that time had to come through masculine form. So I'm experiencing Yeshua as the book, the binding, the blank pages, the form, and she's actually the writing on those pages and the essence. And without each other, it's very difficult to communicate and share what is. So the book without the essence, and the essence without a way to come through into form. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it's very poetic language that you're using. I'll just offer one thing. This text was originally in Greek, and I believe that the word for companion that was in the original text was koinonos. And that word is a much richer word than simply companion. It has many, many layers to it. It can mean business partner. It can mean beloved. It can mean implications of lover. There's all kinds of possibilities, but I think the closest for me that it comes is the Gaelic or Celtic phrase anam cara. And so if you might want to just think of that, sometimes when I read through things, I'll put the original Greek word in my mind when I read it. And so just understanding that if your initial objection was that it somehow felt diminutive to say companion, to think about this koinonos or anam cara as really a partnership, which would definitely have that feeling of equality and reciprocity and mutual nurturance to it. So that might be something that you would consider.
Thank you. And the other thing that I'm noticing, one thing I really appreciate about you is that you're sharing the truth of what happened without demonizing anyone. And I think I'm married to a woman, and I think that equality doesn't come from attacking. So I really appreciate that we can address what was, we can address what is without, if we bring victimhood to it, by bringing victimhood to it, there's no way to have equality from that. So I love how you speak to what is without, we don't have time for the pendulum to swing way the other direction. It's really time, especially as the feminine, to choose to go right to the center of unity.
Thank you. It's so important to realize, that this is the human predicament, and it's not male, female, or Catholic, non-Catholic. We're all in the soup together. We're all in the soup together. And to celebrate wisdom wherever it happens, and then to come together. And I think, the message of this is really, it's the deep union message when Carl Jung was asked, would humanity survive? And his answer after watching, the atom bomb go was, if enough people do their inner work. So each and every one of us needs to tend to that in ourselves without, throwing stones. That it is important to know the history. It is definitely important to know the history so that we don't make similar errors of judging or condemning, and that we do our work. So I hope that my teaching does that, and so thank you for that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Kayleen. Thank you, Michelle. This brings us to the end of our session today. Kayleen, you've given us two profound and brilliant lectures on the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. Thank you so much. And we're going to continue this level of depth in our next book, which will be Bukola Este's work, Women Who Run with the Wolves. So I'm sure that's a book that probably everybody has heard about. It was written several decades ago, but it's really a masterpiece of our generation. And Brenda Crowther, who is a Jungian analyst, as Bukola Este will be commenting on the book. You'll remember Brenda. She did our course a couple months ago on Jung's Red Book. She's a Jungian scholar. She's a Jungian therapist. She's advising one of our doctoral students, actually, in her doctoral thesis. So Brenda is a very powerful teacher. So the next, starting in September and then October, we'll be delving into women who run with the wolves, and a deep Jungian analysis of the feminine, the wild side of the feminine. So again, thank you, Kayleen. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you the second Tuesday of September.
And hope to see some of you for Rosa Mystica and Mary Magdalene journey.
Oh, very good reminder. This Thursday we have Madonna Rising, Rosa Mystica, and then following that we will have the virtual pilgrimage to the sites associated with Mary Magdalene. Bye, everyone.